I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Welcome to this podcast of the People's Pharmacy.
You can find previous podcasts and more information on a range of health topics at peoplespharmacy.com. When Alexander Fleming identified penicillin almost a century ago, it allowed doctors to treat life-threatening infections. This is the People's Pharmacy with Terry and Joe Graydon.
In the 21st century, antibiotics are losing their power. Pathogens have developed resistance to many of the most commonly used medications. Infectious disease expert Dr. Matt McCarthy is concerned.
These drug-resistant bacteria and fungi are everywhere. They are in our grocery stores, they're in our homes, they're in our cars, they're in the nostrils of our healthcare workers. 5% of healthcare doctors and nurses have MRSA in their nose.
Coming up on the People's Pharmacy, learn about the race to stop the epidemic of superbugs.
First, the news.
In the People's Pharmacy health headlines, coronary artery bypass grafting, known as CABG for short, is more effective than stents for treating patients with more than one blocked artery. For years, stents have been overtaking CABG surgery because it's less invasive. However, a new study shows that for people with multivessel coronary artery disease, CABG results in lower mortality after 1 year, 7.2% compared to 11.5% of the patients who had undergone stent placement instead. There were over 800 patients in each group. In addition, the patients who had undergone bypass surgery were less likely to be readmitted to the hospital than those who had gotten stents. The authors recommend a heart team approach to diagnosis and treatment so that patients get the best advice for their particular cardiac condition.
Z-drugs have become very popular sleep aids. These include Zolpidem, known as Ambien, Zaloplan or Sonata, and S-Zobiclone, sold as the brand-name drug Lunesta. A drug safety communication from the FDA warns that people who take these medications may be at higher risk of rare but serious injuries. Some patients engage in complex sleep behaviors, such as eating, walking, or driving, while they're not fully awake. Driving or walking while asleep can result in serious injuries or death. The FDA will require its strongest black box warning for these adverse reactions.
People at risk of developing type 2 diabetes may be able to reverse this process by limiting food intake to a 9-hour period every day. That's the conclusion from a pilot study at the University of Adelaide in Australia. The 15 men in the study wore continuous glucose monitors for a week before the study began and for each of 2 weeks of time-restricted feeding. During one of those weeks, the men ate what they chose between 8 a.m. and 5 p.m. During the other, they ate only between noon and 9 p.m. During the week of eating early, their blood sugar was significantly lower than during the pre-study assessment. After both weeks of time-restricted feeding, the men had much better glucose response to a test meal. They did not have to cut calories to achieve this goal.
Tinnitus, also pronounced tinnitus, is a condition in which the victim hears sounds that others can't perceive. The noises have been described as chirping, humming, hissing, buzzing, whistling, roaring, or ringing. This condition is challenging to treat. A new study from Sweden analyzed data on over 71,000 people. Women with tinnitus were more likely to consider or attempt suicide. Those with severe symptoms were twice as likely to attempt suicide as those with a mild condition. Oddly, people who had a formal diagnosis of tinnitus were not at increased risk of suicide, and men with tinnitus also were no more likely than those without the condition to try to kill themselves. The researchers suggest that doctors should pay more attention to helping people with this invisible condition manage their discomfort.
Are people in pain committing suicide because they can no longer get the opioids they need for pain relief? That question's raised in a perspective piece published in JAMA recently. CDC has asked doctors to clamp down on opioid prescribing as a way to control the epidemic of opioid overdose deaths. As a result, some patients who have been taking these drugs for years have been abruptly withdrawn from their medication. Doctors are concerned about the impact on patient health.
Experts for the United Nations have just issued an alarming analysis about drug-resistant infections. In 2019, 230,000 people will die from multi-drug-resistant tuberculosis. Almost 500,000 more will die from other infections that don't respond to antimicrobial treatment. In the next couple of decades, the experts expect that number to reach 10 million deaths each year. The human and economic toll from superbugs will become staggering. The CDC has identified C. diff, carbapenem-resistant Enterobacteriaceae, and gonorrhea as urgent threats in the U.S. The UN panel is calling for a coordinated global initiative to phase out the use of antimicrobials in animal feed, invest in new technologies to overcome drug resistance, and regulate the inappropriate use of antibiotics. And that's the health news from the People's Pharmacy this week. Welcome to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. An important United Nations report recently warned that pathogens are developing resistance to most commonly used antibiotics. This year, 700,000 people will die worldwide from such infections. The UN analysis predicts that within 3 decades, the death toll could reach 10 million people a year. How do such superbugs evolve, and what can we do about them?
To learn more about this epidemic, we're talking today with Dr. Matt McCarthy. He's an assistant professor of medicine at Weill Cornell Medical School and a staff physician at New York Presbyterian Hospital, where he serves on the ethics committee. Dr. McCarthy is the author of Superbugs, The Race to Stop an Epidemic, to be published on May 21st.
Welcome to the People's Pharmacy, Dr. Matt McCarthy.
It's a pleasure to be here. I'm looking forward to this interview.
Dr. McCarthy, you have a very interesting history. We are going to talk about superbugs, I promise you, but you went from a biochemistry background to ending up in professional baseball, and then from baseball to medicine. How did you follow this rather interesting path?
Yeah, it is kind of a strange path when you put it that way. You know, I grew up in a small town just outside of Orlando, Florida, a place called Winter Springs, Florida. And growing up, all I really wanted to do was be good at something. And the thing that I found that I was pretty good at was baseball. And I was a left-handed pitcher. And the saying goes, and I'm sure your listeners who are baseball fans know this, that if you're a lefty who can throw strikes, you can play baseball for a long time. And my senior year of high school, I got recruited to go play in college. And the first phone call I got was from the head coach of the Yale baseball team, a guy named John Stuper. And he said, "We want to bring you aboard." And so I flew up to New Haven on the spot, said, "This is where I want to go to college." And that started this kind of unusual journey for me. I got to college, and one of the first days I was there, I met a guy named John Stites. He was a freshman like me, and I kind of looked up to this guy. He was going to be a biochemistry major, and I said, "Well, how do you know you're going to do that?" And he said, "Well, my parents are both biochemists." And it turned out that his parents were two of the most famous biochemists in America, Joan Stites, his mom, and Tom Stites, his dad. And I ended up working in laboratories with both of them. And Tom Stites would go on to win the Nobel Prize in chemistry a few years after I worked with him. My work had nothing to do with that prize. But what he was working on was solving the structure of tiny molecules. And those discoveries led to the development of new antibiotics. And so it was through this strange baseball-related route that I got put in touch with a really spectacular couple of scientists who were working on how to develop new antibiotics and new drugs.
Now, did you actually play professional baseball?
So, in college, I was a pretty good left-handed pitcher, and I could throw the ball hard. And if you're a left-handed pitcher who can hit 90 miles an hour, someone is going to give you a chance to play professionally. And I could do that. And so my senior year, I was trying to line up laboratories to work in, as well as looking at potentially going into professional baseball. And in June of my senior year, right after graduation, I got a call on draft day from the Anaheim Angels, and I ended up being selected in the 21st round of the 2002 Major League Baseball draft. So then began a new chapter of my life, and I ended up going out to Provo, Utah, and I played about a year of pro ball. And one of the things about playing every day against really good competitors is you figure out very quickly if you are up to snuff, if you're going to be one of the people who are destined for the big leagues. And I knew very quickly that I was not. And so during my off season, I applied to medical school, and I ended up applying to a few places in the Northeast. And I think the most vivid recollection I have is interviewing at Harvard Medical School. And the dean of admissions had a big picture of Ted Williams above his desk.
A baseball fan.
That's right. And he said, I have one final question for you. Who do you think is the greatest baseball player of all time? And I remember distinctly my head dropped, and I shook my head, and I said, you're not going to like this answer, but it's not Ted Williams. And I looked up, and he was chagrined. And I said, I really think it's Barry Bonds. And he said, oh, no, don't say that. And we had a laugh. But that was sort of this, enduring connection between baseball and medicine that, a couple of months later I was accepted there. And I knew very quickly that I had a more promising career in medicine than being a so-so left-handed pitcher.
So you did end up getting into Harvard.
That's right. And so I ended up enrolled in the fall of 2003, moved to Boston. And when I got there, I wasn't entirely sure what I was going to do with my life. But I happened to go sit in on a lecture by a professor named Paul Farmer. And some of your listeners.
You're not going to believe this. But Terry started Paul Farmer on his career in medical anthropology because she taught him as an undergraduate at Duke University.
No.
Yes.
That's incredible. Well, when I showed up, I walked into this lecture, and I see this young and charismatic medical anthropologist named Paul Farmer who had just come back from Haiti. And he was giving this talk, and he was talking about bringing HIV medications and other medications to people in these impoverished countries. And something just struck me, and I couldn't believe it. And I just said, this is what I want to do. I want to be an infectious disease doctor like Paul Farmer. And it was a really powerful moment to see somebody I was 23 years old, and to see someone and say, I want to be like that. And so that started this journey for me towards infectious diseases. And one of the funny things in my life is that he has popped up all over the place in my world since I've known him. I met him in 2003, and I'll be at baggage claim going to a hospital in South Africa, or in going to catch bats in Cameroon, and I will just run into him all over the world. And so he's been a very powerful influence in my life. And, the book that I read about him, Mountains Beyond Mountains, is something that I think about that book all the time.
Oh, and I think a lot of people found that book absolutely compelling, that book by Tracy Kidder.
Well, I have to tell you, we just recently saw Paul Farmer ourselves. We were at a big, what would you call it, Terry?
Well, it's the Bryant Series,
right,
in Greensboro. It's sponsored by Guilford College.
And I saw this man walk in, and he rushed over and gave Terry this big hug and kiss. I thought, who is that guy hugging my wife? And of course, it was Paul Farmer, and he thanked her for starting him on his journey as well. Well, you also had some very interesting experiences with a physician by the name of Tom Walsh. And yes. Dr. Walsh was a transplant and cancer doc, and focusing on infectious disease at Weill Cornell. It seems to me that that's an area where infectious disease is especially important, because people who have, received chemotherapy or whose immune systems are suppressed because of a transplant are especially vulnerable to nasty bugs.
Absolutely. I'm a professor at the medical school, and I teach the medical students and the residents about patients' risk for developing infections. And one of the things that people don't always appreciate is that if you have cancer, your immune system doesn't function like everyone else. whether you've received chemotherapy or not. If you get diagnosed with a malignancy, no matter what it is, there's something about the presence of that tumor that can alter your immune system. And so you become somewhat higher risk for developing these infections. And so Tom Walsh, who I has served as my mentor for a decade, he has dedicated his career to investigating how the bugs in our environment affect people with cancer and what we can do to protect people from getting superbug infections.
How did the two of you become collaborators?
You know, it's one of these, as luck would have it, stories. So after I graduated from Harvard Medical School, my wife and I met her in medical school. We moved to New York City, and we both did our residency training at Columbia Presbyterian. And during the internal medicine process, you can decide to subspecialize in something. And I knew from meeting Paul Farmer that I wanted to go into the infectious diseases. And I interviewed at places around New York City. And when I was interviewing at Weill Cornell, I told the person who was the head of the department, I said, you know, there's a lot of attention in the infectious disease world paid to HIV, but I want to do something different. I'm interested in the infections that affect people with cancer and other types of immune system problems. And he said, well, there's a guy down the hall who's literally moving in to his laboratory today, if you want to go meet him. And I said, today? Like right now? And he said, yeah, there's a guy named Tom Walsh coming from the NIH. You got to meet him. So I walk down the hall, and I see this guy. And I should say that he and I, Tom Walsh and I, couldn't look more different. You know, I'm a pretty big guy, got big shoulders, big nose, big forehead, and Tom's this very modest, smaller guy, and I tower over him. But I immediately was taken by the brain that he has, and he pulled out a pen and a paper, and he started drawing what he envisioned was the next 10 years of my career studying this stuff. And he took out multiple colored pens, and he started scribbling furiously. And I took that piece of paper home, and I showed my wife, and I said, I think I'm going to spend the next 10 years working with this guy, and here's his plan for me. And I ended up scanning that piece of paper in to an email, and I now have it as my first PowerPoint slide when I give talks to medical students and residents about this area of infections. And I say, everything that I've done really has been because I happened to meet Tom. And what I really think is so important in medicine especially is the power of a good mentor. You know, we talk a lot in academic medicine about how do we advance people and how do we recruit people from various groups. And I say, well, you've got to have good mentors. And I'm very fortunate that I've had one in Tom Walsh.
You're listening to Dr. Matt McCarthy, Assistant Professor of Medicine at Weill Cornell Medical School and a staff physician at New York Presbyterian Hospital. Dr. McCarthy is Editor-in-Chief of Current Fungal Infection Reports and author of Superbugs, The Race to Stop an Epidemic, to be published May 21st.
After the break, we'll find out what we can do as patients to reduce our risk.
Learn how Alexander Fleming discovered penicillin nearly a century ago.
We'll also find out about a new antibiotic, dalbavancin, and the patient who inspired Dr. McCarthy to try it.
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon.
The People's Pharmacy podcast is sponsored in part by Kaya Biotics. KAYA Biotics offers the first probiotics which are both certified organic and hypoallergenic.
All probiotics are produced in Germany under laboratory conditions with high-quality ingredients and under strict regulatory oversight.
The 3 available formulas are created for very specific purposes, such as strengthening the immune system, fighting yeast infections, and helping with weight loss.
To learn more about Kaya Biotics probiotics and the important topic of gut health, you can visit their website, KayaBiotics.com. That's KAYA Biotics.com. Use the discount code PEOPLE for $10 off your first purchase. Welcome back to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Terry Graydon.
And I'm Joe Graydon. If you'd like to purchase a CD of this show, you can call 800-732-2334. Today's show, 1164. That number again, 800-732-2334, or online at peoplespharmacy.com. You can also download the podcast from iTunes.
The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by Verizana, an analytical laboratory providing home health tests for hormones, gut health, and the microbiome. Online at verisana.com.
We're talking today about pathogens that have evolved resistance to the antibiotics we use to treat them. As a result, patients may die from infections that would have been successfully treated just a decade or two ago.
Our guest is Dr. Matt McCarthy. He's an assistant professor of medicine at Weill Cornell Medical School and a staff physician at New York Presbyterian Hospital. Dr. McCarthy is editor-in-chief of Current Fungal Infection Reports. His latest book is Superbugs, The Race to Stop an Epidemic, coming out May 21st.
Dr. McCarthy, what can we do as patients when it comes to reducing our risk? If we have to, for example, go into the clinic or into the hospital, we hear a lot about hand washing and how important it is for health professionals, and I think they're doing a much, much better job than maybe 20 years ago. But we heard recently that maybe patients and their families and friends should also be washing their hands because they're as likely to be contaminated as the doctors.
You're absolutely right. Hand washing is crucial. One of the other things you can do is just notice your environment and also notice the people who are in the environment. Are the doctors and the nurses taking proper precautions? Are they wearing gloves? Are they wearing gowns if necessary? Are they doing the things to limit your exposure to all of the different bacteria and fungi that are in the environment? The other thing is to be aware if you're feeling sick, for example, you have a cold, your immune system is not at its best. You are at higher risk when you're not feeling well. And don't put yourself in a position where you could be exposed to these things. That's a tricky thing when you're feeling unwell and you need to go to the doctor. But sometimes people wear surgical masks. You can do things to prevent your lungs from being exposed to the various pathogens. But if you're otherwise feeling well, I would not spend time being worried that you're going to pick up a superbug by simply going to the doctor. It's really for the patients who have an altered immune system or who are under the weather that day. But hand hygiene is certainly a great way to start, and then noticing if the other people in your environment are doing the same things. And if they're not, stay away from those people.
Dr. McCarthy, early in your book, Superbugs, The Race to Stop an Epidemic, you describe the person who discovered penicillin, Dr. Alexander Fleming. This is before he discovered penicillin. He was in the battlefield in the Great War, what we now call World War I. Can you tell us what he was doing and what he was thinking?
This was one of my favorite parts to write about. So I'm a bit of a history buff. And I had heard the story of Alexander Fleming before, but what I hadn't done was go back to look at the original scientific articles that he had written. So a few years ago, I started combing through my medical school's library to try to find exactly what he was writing while he was a doctor who was serving in the military. And so I should explain that Alexander Fleming went to medical school in London, and then after that, he was assigned to a military hospital, which was in the basement of an old casino in France. And when he was there, he was charged with taking care of the war injured and the people who were getting exposed to shrapnel and all of these terrible things that were happening on the battlefield. And one of the things that Fleming noticed was that his method for treating these infections, when the gunshot wound would get infected, he was told to pour antiseptic fluid onto these wounds. But there was a problem, which is that the wounds didn't always get better. And what was interesting was that a subset of the soldiers were coming down with an obscure disease called tetanus. And tetanus is caused by a bacterium that lives under the soil. And it's known in medical terminology as an anaerobic organism, which means that if it's exposed to oxygen, it will die. But for some reason, these tetanus molecules and tetanus bacteria were getting into the flesh, and somehow they were proliferating and they were growing even when he poured the antiseptic fluid on it. And so what I went back and looked at was the original scientific articles that Fleming was writing describing what he was finding. And it was clear that he thought that antiseptic fluid wasn't helping his soldiers, but in fact it was making things worse. And Alexander Fleming had this unique skill that he learned before he became a doctor, which is that he was able to do something called glass blowing. And he could blow glass into all kinds of shapes, and he often made scampering cats and mice and little trinkets for his friends and family. But he used this ability to start creating these new experiments, and he could make his own experimental glassware. And he used that to create these elegant experiments to show that these bacteria were living out in the recesses of the wounds in places where the antiseptic fluid couldn't get to. Now, the war ended, World War I, and Fleming went back to London and back to his laboratory, and he didn't discover penicillin right away. It was actually not until 1928 that he was stumbling around in his laboratory, and he saw that there was this fungus which had grown in a place where it shouldn't. And it turned out that the fungus was producing a molecule that at such an extraordinary level that it could kill bacteria. But he didn't recognize a key feature in 1928. He thought that it wasn't producing it enough to actually kill bacteria in the human body. And so the story actually kind of went away for a while. And it wasn't until World War II when some other people at Oxford, other scientists, recognized this extraordinary finding. And Fleming teamed up with these researchers at Oxford, and they paired with the burgeoning pharmaceutical industry. And it was during World War II that we really see penicillin come into its own as the first commercially available antibiotic.
What's so extraordinary about your description regarding penicillin is that, here was truly the first silver bullet, sort of magical medicine. I think we all look back at pharmacology and we go, that was the moment when everything changed. And here we are all these decades later, and penicillin is a shortage. What the heck is going on?
This is one of the most heartbreaking parts of the penicillin story, is that it was discovered, it became this incredibly valuable resource. It was used to treat hundreds of millions of people. There's an estimate that it saved 200 million lives. And now we see that there are shortages all over the world. And the reason is that penicillin is often most useful for conditions that affect poor people. We find that people in India desperately need this to prevent something called rheumatoid heart disease. And you know what? The pharmaceutical companies are saying, it costs us $20 million a year to maintain a laboratory to produce penicillin. It's not worth it to us to do it.
Because poor people don't pay big money for it.
That's exactly right. And, the problem with penicillin and with any antibiotic is that they're given in short courses. Doctors are stingy about doling it out. And even the best antibiotic is eventually going to run into some drug resistance from the bacteria. So you have these pharmaceutical executives who are looking at that and comparing it to something like Lipitor or Viagra, which people can take every day in perpetuity. And they're saying it's not worth it to us to continue this. We're going to do something else. We're accountable to shareholders, not to patients.
Well, to say that's shocking is an understatement. It drives me a little crazy, and I think we're going to have to come up with a new model for some of the drugs that are in short supply. There are more than 100 of them right now in the United States, and I suspect more worldwide. And that penicillin could be in short supply just seems outrageous. But you've kind of opened the door to the issue that you really focus on in your book, and that is the concept of superbugs. And you start your book with a person by the name of Jackson. And it's so interesting that the drug of last resort for this gentleman who had I assume a gunshot wound, some kind of a wound that was infected, was very similar to a story that was on 60 Minutes not that long ago a person from the United States who had a terrible accident and developed a superbug that was also only susceptible to colistin. So could you tell us a little bit about Jackson and colistin and why this drug, which is so toxic, it was the only opportunity to save his life?
Right. This was a heartbreaking case, and I've known this patient for years. But you're exactly right. So he's a mechanic in Queens, and he was, hit by a stray bullet. And it turned out that the bullet had bacteria on it, and the bacteria in the area surrounding the bullet wound became infected. And when he came into the emergency room, the ER doctors looked at it and said, "This does not look good. Let's call in McCarthy." And so I came to see the patient, and I was with my team, which includes medical students, residents, pharmacists, nutritionists. There's a whole big team of us. And one of the students pulled out a piece of paper, and it showed the result of a microbiological test. And it showed that this bacterium had become resistant to every antibiotic known to man except for one, and that was colistin. And for those of you who prescribe this drug or have received it, you know just how toxic it is. It shreds kidneys. It can cause neurologic dysfunction. If you go on social media and you type in the word colistin, you'll see doctors asking. They'll say, "Has anyone used this? Can you get away with using it? It's my only option, but I'm afraid it's going to kill the patient."
And it's an old drug. I mean, it goes back to the 40s.
Yeah, it's an old drug. A lot of people consider it essentially detergent. And, it's like injecting detergent into a patient. I use that as a launching point to say, how did we get here? How is it that everyone recognizes we need more antibiotics, and we've got these patients who are desperate for help? What's the problem? And more importantly, what's the solution? And that was what I was so eager to look at, is what are the meaningful steps we can take to actually improve the situation? Because it seems like every week we hear another report of some new superbug or some new problem with drug-resistant bacteria, but those articles aren't hammering home all of the work that's being done to address the problem.
Dr. McCarthy, I wonder if you would explain exactly how these bugs, whether they're bacteria or even fungi, develop resistance in the first place.
Yeah, this is an area of active investigation, and I've spent the last 10 years looking at this. And one of the interesting things about all of the things on our planet is the ability to mutate and to evolve. And when you put a bacterium into a person's body and you expose them to antibiotics, the bacteria immediately go to work figuring out, how do we mutate, how do we change so that this antibiotic doesn't work? And some of the really extraordinary things that I have seen there's one called efflux pumps, that the bacteria can develop these tiny microscopic vacuum cleaners that can suck up the antibiotic and spit it out. And they can come up with these enzymes that can chew up the antibiotic. And they're able to do this very quickly. And so we're constantly at war, this kind of microscopic war with the bacteria, figuring out how can we create new drugs that they can't chop up or that they'll have a more difficult time. And some of the things I write about are these Trojan horse approaches, where we'll attach an antibiotic to something like copper or iron, and the bug will see the iron and say, "Ooh, I want the iron." And then they ingest the iron, and along with it comes the antibiotic. And we're finding that that's now a promising approach. But it's all of these radical new strategies that we're having to use because the bacteria are relentless, and they will do anything they can to evade what we throw at them.
Can you tell us what happened to Jackson?
I can tell you that he was eventually successfully treated, but that treatment involved a surgical resection. I can't go into too many details, but one of the things that I have found in many cases is that what we are returning to is essentially similar to what Fleming returned to, which is that for these bad infections, the answer, the treatment involves a hacksaw, not some precision medicine or some incredible antibiotic. It's just cutting the thing out. And that's ultimately what we had to do.
Well, you write in your book, my patients were increasingly whisked away to the operating room for surgical removal of gangrenous limbs because antibiotics were no longer effective, which seems kind of unbelievable. Like we've turned back the clock 100 years. Tell us about the patient who inspired you and Dr. Walsh to think of trying dalbavancin.
Well, one of the subtle shifts that I've seen in my career is that a number of the infections that I used to encounter, I could look at the condition, a skin infection, and I could say, I've got 3 or 4 pill options that I could give this patient, things like Bactrim or clindamycin or doxycycline. I could give them a 10-day prescription and send them on their way. But what started happening a few years ago is that those same patients were coming back to me. They were coming back to the emergency room, and they were saying that antibiotic didn't work, and in fact, this infection is spreading. And so we needed a new treatment because currently what we do for those patients is we now put them on an intravenous antibiotic, something like vancomycin, and we admit them to the hospital. And they sit there, and they'll get their vancomycin infusion, and then they'll sit in the hospital bed for the other 23 hours of the day, watching TV and waiting for, as life goes by. And we weren't satisfied with that. And I can say there wasn't a single patient that inspired us or prompted us to go in this direction. It was a cluster, and it was a trend that we were seeing and saying, this is not acceptable anymore. We need something new. It's not okay to put somebody on an antibiotic like vancomycin, which does have side effects itself. It can cause kidney problems. It can cause a well-characterized rash called red man syndrome. And we said, let's see if there's a better option out there. And in fact, that was one of those options was this new drug called dalbavancin. And it has a number of really interesting properties. Most notably is that you give one dose and it can stay in the system for a very long time, for weeks at a time.
Can you tell us any more about it?
Yeah, so it's been shown, it was identified years ago as this incredibly promising antibiotic and fast-tracked for FDA approval. And I write a little bit about the challenge of getting that approval. But it was eventually approved in 2014 by the FDA. But there was a problem, which is that it's so expensive to develop a drug that companies aren't going to just give it away once they get it approved. So they said, this drug is going to cost a few $1,000s for the dose. And that was obviously concerning to hospitals and to formulary committees who have tight budgets and say, well, I don't know if we can afford this. And a lot of hospitals said, we can't afford this. So Tom Walsh and I helped convince a company to fund the study, to give us the drug for free so that we could see how best to use it. Our trial was a success. We showed that we could get people out of the hospital more quickly than with the standard of care. And what's been very exciting is that we studied this for skin infections, but there's a lot of interest in broadening that to other areas like bone infections. And some people are looking at heart infections. And we're trying to figure out how best do we use this powerful new antibiotic, which happens to be incredibly expensive.
You're listening to infectious disease expert Dr. Matt McCarthy, assistant professor of medicine at Weill Cornell Medical School. His book is Superbugs, The Race to Stop an Epidemic, out on May 21st.
After the break, we'll find out why healthcare facilities so often put up a wall of silence around superbug infections.
Can pathogens be spread on phones, watches, and white coats?
What should we do to fight superbugs?
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon. This People's Pharmacy podcast is brought to you in part by Verizana.com.
Verizana Lab offers home health tests that allow you to monitor your hormones and health conditions. You can take control of the quantitative assessment of your health and learn about male and female hormone balance, the stress hormone cortisol, leaky gut, gluten intolerance, or your gut microbiome.
Take a more active role in tracking your health and take 20% off your first order of a mail-in testing opportunity with the discount code PEOPLE. That's PEOPLE, all uppercase. To learn more, go to Verizana.com. That's Verisana.com. Welcome back to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Terry Graydon.
And I'm Joe Graydon. To purchase a CD of today's show or any other People's Pharmacy broadcast, you can call 800-732-2334. Today's show is 1164. That number again, 800-732-2334, online at peoplespharmacy.com. You can also download the free podcast from iTunes or from our web store. We invite you to consider writing a review.
The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by Biotics, probiotic products made in Germany from certified organic ingredients. KAYA Biotics.com.
How would you know if your local hospital or nursing home was having trouble with drug-resistant infections? Are there places you can look that up? Perhaps there should be. How can we fight the superbugs that are killing people?
Our guest is Dr. Matt McCarthy. He is an assistant professor of medicine at Weill Cornell Medical School and a staff physician at New York Presbyterian Hospital. Dr. McCarthy is editor-in-chief of Current Fungal Infection Reports. His latest book is Superbugs, The Race to Stop an Epidemic. It'll be out May 21st.
Dr. McCarthy, we keep hearing about all these superinfections and how there are bugs that have been evolving through the process that you've already talked about. And hospitals all around the country are beginning to have patients with infections that they can't treat with most of the antibiotics that are available to them. And yet, this still seems very remote for most people. In part because there's kind of a code of silence. I mean, hospitals don't share a lot of information about superbugs and problem infections. Why is that? Why don't we have more information and more access to what's going on?
I can tell you this morning I was working on a piece called Superbugs and the Climate of Secrecy. So I share your assessment that there is this tremendous hesitancy on the part of medical centers to address this. And one of the things that I think is important to know is that these drug-resistant bacteria and fungi are everywhere. They are in our grocery stores, they're in our homes, they're in our cars, they're in the nostrils of our healthcare workers. 5% of healthcare doctors and nurses have MRSA in their nose. And one study just showed that more than 10% of patients entering a hospital have a superbug infection on their skin. So what the hesitancy and the climate of secrecy that's coming from the medical centers, I think, and I'm not speaking for anyone other than myself here, is that they're afraid that people won't understand if they know the truth. And I think that's a real shame. I think that what we're seeing is these articles coming out about a patient dying from a superbug infection, and the hospital is saying no comment. And the truth is that no comment is no longer sufficient here. We need to be open about this. And what I tell my patients is, I'm not particularly interested in the superbugs that one hospital has or another one has. What I'm interested in is, are the people who work in those hospitals following the strict protocols to make sure that those bugs don't go where they shouldn't? And I can tell you the irony in all of this is that the best medical centers, the top hospitals in the world, are the ones that have the most superbugs. And the reason for that is that they have the most sophisticated diagnostic techniques, so they can catch these bugs before everyone else. They have the most powerful antibiotics, so that they can treat these things. And they also have the experts who know how to treat them. So we have patients who are referred into us who have no one else who knows how to treat them. And I write about this, is that Tom Walsh is frequently called by a frantic doctor in Germany or in Denver or in Seattle saying, I don't know what else to do. There's no studies. There's nothing to guide me. I've heard that I should ask you for help. And so there's this climate of secrecy, and that's because they're trying to prevent a climate of fear. But that's not good enough. That's not an acceptable answer. And I think what we need to be open about is the fact that there are drug-resistant bacteria all around us. And in fact, they're inside many of us. You know, we have trillions of bacteria that live inside of us. And statistically, a certain percentage of those will be resistant to antibiotics. So once we can start all discussing this openly, I think it becomes a lot less scary. But I can tell you that's one of the reasons I enjoy writing about this so much, is because I think that there is such a gulf between what the clinicians are seeing day to day in the hospital and what's being written about. Because there's a lot of fear-mongering and there's a lot of alarmist pieces that are out there. And the last thing that I would want is for somebody to avoid medical care because they're afraid they're going to pick up a superbug. You're just as going to the grocery store. The meat aisle has tons of superbugs. And the reason for that is that we pump our poultry and a lot of our other animals full of antibiotics so that they produce this really robust meat. And the byproduct of that is that they have drug-resistant bacteria all over them. And the key here is for us to just all be on the same, I think, wavelength talking about this stuff, and to say, just because there's a superbug found in a hospital, we don't have to freak out, that we can talk about it and we can say, here's how doctors and nurses and patients can protect themselves, and here's what we do moving forward. But part of that is understanding how we got to this place and why is it that we're seeing these things now. You could swab any person walking down the street and probably find a drug-resistant bacterium. That hasn't really been talked about. But once we can address that, we can figure out ways to move forward.
Well, I do want to ask you how we're going to move forward, but I also want to ask you a slightly alarmist question. As we were preparing for our interview with you, we found a prediction that suggested by the year 2050, superbug infections will be killing more people than cancer. Does that seem likely to you, or is that being overly alarmist?
Well, the interesting thing here is that after the discovery of penicillin and the pharmaceutical companies entered what was called as the golden age of drug development, which was the 1950s. And they produced 1 month after another, one new drug, one miracle drug after another emerged. And what happened during this period is that we took our eyes off the ball. And people said, we're creating so many new antibiotics, let's focus on heart disease and cancer. And it was that shift in mentality, focusing on other diseases, that allowed superbugs and other types of infections to proliferate. And so now we're reaching this tipping point where it's actually swinging back in the other direction, that we're having so many different drug-resistant bacterium that have come back that they're now emerging as a threat that equals or potentially surpasses cancer and heart disease. You know, I have mixed emotions when I see an alarmist article like that saying that superbugs could kill more people than heart disease or cancer. Because on the one hand, I'm deeply troubled that we've gotten to this position. But a small part of me is relieved that we're actually addressing this, because those of us who have been seeing these patients have been screaming from the treetops that we have these problems for years. And, you know, academic journals have been, and meetings, and people have been talking about this global crisis for years. And now it feels like it's kind of entering the popular culture and the popular consciousness. And so what I think people need to, educate themselves, because this story's not going away. We want people to be able to have a conversation about these superbugs in a way that's not just about the fear and about the, alarmist approach. I think it's possible that it will become the main public health issue of our lifetime. I absolutely do. And the reason for that is that heart disease and cancer are never going away, but we have such financial incentives to address these two issues that we will continue to fight them. There isn't the incentive to fight superbugs. We're frequently hearing about them after the fact, after someone has died. And then we turn to the pharmaceutical companies and they say, don't blame us, the market's not there.
Well, the market may be there, sadly to say. Dr. McCarthy, I got into quite a heated argument with a dear friend who is a physician, infectious disease expert in a cancer hospital. And I was asking him about why some people are more susceptible to infections than others. And I was particularly concerned about what physicians refer to as fomites, places where nasty bugs can hang out, like on computer keyboards or on stethoscopes or pens or phones and iPads and watches and ties and white coats. And he said, Joe, don't worry about all that. It's only the people who have a compromised immune system where I work, in a multiple myeloma center where people really, they don't have the resistance that you need to worry about that stuff. Otherwise healthy people, not a problem. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I get asked this quite a bit, actually. And I can tell you that, I walk into a hospital almost every single day that's surrounded by patients who have infections, and I'm not concerned. I'm not worried about my own health and my own safety. We've entered this era of precision medicine where we're finding that everyone's body is unique, everyone's immune system is unique. And so it's very difficult to make a blanket statement that if you have a normal immune system, you're not at risk. And the reason for that is that we have found that there is no such thing as normal, that everyone has variations in their immune system. But, one of the very helpful things, or historically helpful things, is to look at your experience thus far. If you're a 50-year-old man and you've lived your whole life without having infections, you probably have an immune system that can fend off the average superbug that's sitting on a blood pressure cuff or on an x-ray machine. But if you're somebody who chronically has infections, you have likely a defect in your immune system that predisposes you to something. And I think of my father-in-law, who I'm very close with, and he tends to get staph infections. And we say to him, he clearly has some defect in his immune system that allows him to get these types of infections. And the concerning thing is that there are fewer and fewer drugs to treat staph infections. So your friend, I think in broad strokes, is correct that if you've lived a life relatively free of infections, then I wouldn't be particularly worried about superbugs. The thing that I am getting worried about are all of these viral infections that are returning. I'm much more concerned if a person with measles walks into our emergency room than if somebody with a superbug walks into our emergency room.
Right.
I want to ask about not viruses and not bacteria, but fungus. You've written that fungal work sometimes feels like an intellectual backwater. Bacteria are getting all the attention. What can you tell us about fungal infections?
Yeah, this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart. As the editor of a fungal journal, I spend a lot of time thinking about the fungus among us. And I can tell you, as I was traveling this morning to work, I was reading about a fungal infection in bottlenose dolphins. And it's something that is all around us. There are in many basements and attics, we've got these fungi that in certain people can cause a really serious infection. And the main ones that we think about, there are the Candida species, and then there are these other ones called Aspergillus, and there's all kinds of unique ones that are in the environment. And when people take a hit to the immune system, that's when you become susceptible to these things. I got into it because my mentor, Tom Walsh, is one of the world experts in fungal infections. And so I've spent the past 10 years learning how to care for these patients. And the devastating thing is that there are only 3 major classes of antifungal drugs. And the interest in creating new antifungal agents is even smaller than it is for coming up with new antibacterial agents. And really, there is almost no interest in creating a new antifungal drug. And that becomes a problem when you have an outbreak of something or you have a new fungus that emerges, such as Candida auris, which has emerged in the United States. And people are suddenly saying, oh, well, what are the treatment options? Why don't we have more options? And it's because of the finances. And it's really hard to look at a grieving family or a nervous patient and say that there's no other option.
Well, it's so interesting. The physician that I was arguing with about fomites and infections in hospitals, he had actually studied fungal infections in hospitals in the shower. He said, I worry about cancer patients who have compromised immune systems taking a hot shower and breathing in the fungi. And I went, really? In the shower?
Yeah, it's true. The way that I broadly think of my patients is, are they somebody who's low risk, medium risk, or high risk for infection? I don't put anyone in the no risk. Everyone's at some risk. And I would put cancer patients, especially those getting chemotherapy, as high risk. And, I just sometimes want to put my arms around them and not let them do anything because there are so many risky things that are in our environment. And that's in stark contrast to many of the other people who I take care of who don't have cancer, don't have these aggressive diseases that affect their immune system. But it's certainly the case. I investigated an outbreak in 2013 of an obscure fungus called Exorahilum rostratum. And patients all across the United States were exposed to this fungus because they were going to centers to get steroid injections into their back for chronic low back pain. And the compounding pharmacy that made the steroid injection had done so under unsanitary conditions, and a fungus had grown in the vials. And so doctors were injecting fungus directly into patients' spines.
Ooh.
Yeah. And it was an outbreak that affected, thousands of people, and hundreds were debilitated. And the scary part is that in medicine, we like to have evidence to guide us. But this was something where there was no precedent. There was no evidence. So it was, being on frantic conference calls with a handful of experts to figure out what do we do with our limited treatment options to save people.
Dr. McCarthy, we have just a minute left with you. Can you tell us what should we be doing going forward to fight superbugs?
I think that one of the important things is to recognize that antibiotics are a global resource and that there is a market failure and that companies are not going to produce new antibiotics, and that we need to have civic engagement. We need to encourage people to read up on this, to understand it so that we can advocate for new methods. There are things called push and pull incentives that we can do through the federal government that will allow companies to invest in new antibiotics with mitigating some of the risk. And we can also encourage them to do it through things called pull incentives, so that if they do develop a new drug, they have incentive to keep that drug and to keep developing more new drugs. This is not a simple issue. It's something that's very complex, but it's something that we're now all going to be talking about, and we're certainly going to be talking about it for the rest of our lives.
Dr. Matt McCarthy, thank you ever so much for talking with us on the People's Pharmacy today.
Thank you so much for having me.
You've been listening to Dr. Matt McCarthy, Assistant Professor of Medicine at Weill Cornell Medical School and Staff Physician at New York Presbyterian Hospital. Dr. McCarthy is Editor-in-Chief of Current Fungal Infection Reports. He's also author of 2 best-selling books, Odd Man Out and The Real Doctor Will See You Shortly. His latest book is Superbugs, The Race to Stop an Epidemic. It will be published on May 21st, and I encourage you to pre-order it or to get your hands on it somehow. It's a wonderful read.
Lynn Siegel produced today's show. Al Wodarski engineered. Dave Graydon edits our interviews.
The People's Pharmacy is produced at the studios of North Carolina Public Radio, WUNC.
The People's Pharmacy theme music is by B.J. Liederman.
If you would like to buy a CD of today's show or any other People's Pharmacy broadcast, you can call 800-732-2334. Today's show is number 1164. That number again, 800-732-2334. You can also find it online at peoplespharmacy.com.
When you visit our site, you can share your thoughts about today's show. Have you ever been infected with a hard-to-treat pathogen? How did you overcome it?
At peoplespharmacy.com, you can sign up for our free online newsletter or subscribe to the free podcast of the show. That way, you'll never miss another episode, and you can share it with a friend.
When you sign up for the newsletter, you'll get our free e-guide to favorite home remedies. In Durham, North Carolina, I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Thanks very much for listening, and please do join us again next week.
We hope you enjoyed this podcast. If so, please consider taking a minute to write a review on iTunes. And thanks for listening to The People's Pharmacy.